Hello, in this video I'm going to be looking at the new tier 10 super heavy type 5 heavy. Also for this video, if you do hear some background noise, I do apologise. It is raining and very windy today, so you may hear that in the background. But anyway, type 5 heavy. This is a new tier 10 Japanese heavy tank. It is the heaviest tank in the game at 201.6 tons. It's also the largest tank in the game by a pretty big margin. On top of that, it's also the highest alpha heavy tank in the game for now, with 800 alpha on its premium AP and 700 on its standard AP. So it is a pretty unique and different vehicle for the game. But let's just get right into its stats. So here we have the Type 5 Heavy on its armor profile, and of course there is a review on my website if you want to have a look at everything about the Type 5 without this commentary. But here you can see its armor profile against 252mm of AP, fairly normal tier 10 standard penetration. You can see there are no major plate weak points. The turret front is strong, the hull front is strong, the lower plate is strong. The only weak points on the Type 5 Heavy are of course its cupola and these two areas on its lower plate. These two hatches do look like they are penetrable, but here they are actually not. This is the highlight that happens when the hatches, which are 3D, go 25% invisible, just because they are not actually modelled properly as part of the base armour. And you can see that if we go to look at the Type 5 Heavy's armour profile here. You can see that these front bits here, the hatches and the small support gun, are not actually 3D modelled, so therefore when you're looking at it in game and you can't penetrate, like here, it goes 25% invisible. It's a bit of a troll because it does look penetrable, but those are actually not penetrable in that image. Next, you can see when you do angle the tank, it does have very good hull side armor, and also it does have that hull shoulder weak point, which is fair considering if it didn't have that weak point and that was strong, this tank would just be so good at angling, so good at side scraping, and it would make it really rather OP, and you will see why with its armor profile as I get more into it. But its hull side armor, you can see here that it is actually very thick, with the tracks on the outside being 25mm thick, the area behind the tracks being 140mm thick, and then on top of all this there's a 50mm spaced armor plate. And then if you're talking about above the tracks, this area is 110 with 50mm of spaced armor on top of it. So if you're looking at a Type 5 from the side, or it's angled like this, and you have Hesh, don't shoot it. Just use AP and go through the side of the hull, because this whole area is spaced. On top of this, this does help quite a bit against heat ammo, just because it is fairly thick spaced armor. But next, switching to premium ammo, which is in this case 330mm of penetration, you can see the lower plate does become penetrable now. These areas on the upper plate also do become actual weak points. You can see rather than them being sort of like invisible, they are now properly highlighted as penetrable. And then of course the cupola on the top does become slightly weaker. You can also see when you do turn the hull and the turret cheek does become a bit weak, just because you are not actually facing the enemy. And then of course this front armor plate of the hull does become slightly more penetrable, but of course because this is heat, it won't be so reliable. And just for reference, this lower plate is 300mm thick, meaning any heavy tank can go through it easily, but mediums, which are not using calibrated shells, will struggle a bit. But that was the view with a heavy tank that uses gun rammer, for example. Now I'll talk about what the armor looks like with calibrated shells on, which in this case is 275mm on AP. You can see these weak points on the upper plate are now more penetrable. The weak points on the lower plate also show up with a bit of a bigger penetrable area, and same thing for the cupola. You can see it's just slightly more penetrable on the edges. And then here you can see angling the tank why you don't want to be side scraping, because it does have that big weak point on the edge of the upper plate. But switching to premium ammo, in this case 367, you can see the armor of the Type 5 is quite weak, just because it is very flat armor. Lower plate penetrable, of course, upper plate completely penetrable with ever so slightly red highlighting, and then the turret is mainly penetrable. In this case, 367mm of heat will have no issues going through the tank's frontal armour, but you can see that if you do angle the hull, the upper plate does become good again, and then the turret can slightly be angled, but it doesn't quite become effective against 367. So, you may be thinking, well, Type 5's armour sucks against calibrated shells, and I use calibrated shells, therefore I will have no problem dealing with a Type 5. While that may be true, you have to consider that you are a good player. You know what calibrated shells does, you know its uses. Most players who play the game don't even use equipment, let alone use calibrated shells. So you do have to consider that a lot of the players you face, which of course not the good players, but the more casual ones, the more ones who are just playing the game for fun, they won't be seeing an armor profile like this. They'll be seeing something more like this, and they'll really struggle to deal with your armor. And from having played this tank for 100, 200 games, I can tell you that its armor does bounce a ton of shots when you do come against players who don't really know what they're doing and don't load premium ammo or don't have calibrated shells on. So you do have to consider that. Yes, you may face a good player sometimes who can, of course, deal with your armor, but for the majority of cases, enemies won't have too easy of a time to deal with you. But yeah, overall, good armor for the Type 5 Heavy. Especially on the side, and I completely forgot to mention, but the rear armor actually isn't bad at all either. 180mm on the hull rear, and then 200 on the turret rear, which does make it actually pretty troll for low penetration tier 9 tanks or stock tier 9 tanks, or just tanks which have HESH, which are trying to deal with you. One thing you do have to be careful of is this 80mm plate at the rear of the turret. It does mean tanks which know about this 80mm plate will be able to HE you even with your own 82mm of HE penetration, for example, like this. You can see that there, and if you run calibrated shells, of course, it does become fully green. But just a few things to note for the armor. Next, let's talk about the gun. This tank mounts a 152mm gun. Its ammo is AP/AP-HE, and this tank is one of those which does more damage on its premium ammo than on its standard ammo. So, talking about which ammo you're going to be using more, it's going to be the premium AP. In this case, penetration 255, 205 on premium, and then 82 on HE, which is very nice considering most of the time Wargaming has been nerfing the HE down from really what it should be. Alpha damage 700 on your standard AP, which in this case you would use more like premium, 800 alpha on your premium AP, which again with its lower penetration you'd be using this more like standard ammo, and then 1100 on its HE, which is just massive. It is up there close to sort of what the Jagdpanzer E100 can deal with its HE. Next, 18-second reload. Of course that is very long, but because of its high alpha it is not bad DPM at all at 2325, and again that is your quote-unquote premium. If you do use the lower penetration higher damage ammo, which you should on premium, it will be around 2650 DPM, which is very good actually considering its alpha damage. Usually tanks with 600 alpha don't have more than 2600 DPM. But next, talking about gun handling, this tank has pretty poor aim time of 4.6/4.9. Base aim time, again poor, 3.15, that's around where the 183 sits at. Dispersion 0.407, again very poor, one of the worst in tier 10. And then gun handling of 0.2, 0.22 and 0.13 actually isn't terrible considering this tank's alpha damage. However, do consider that this tank does do a lot of alpha damage, so for its aim time, for its accuracy, it's actually not the worst thing in the world. On top of this, it's not a very fast tank, so you don't actually get to fully bloom out for most of the time, and you can actually be relatively accurate. I've found from experience of playing the tank, this tank doesn't feel insanely inaccurate. However, the biggest issues are the shell velocity. 500 on your standard, 650 on your premium, and 400 on your HE. It makes using the standard ammo and the HE ammo outside of very close range quite difficult, and then your premium AP, of course, that is low penetration, so even though its shell velocity is decent, which, let's be honest, 650 is nothing amazing, but it's usable compared to the other shelves, its penetration is just low on that premium ammo. But then 8 degrees of gun depression is a nice factor to have on this vehicle, especially considering how big it is. But overall, it is actually a pretty good gun, considering everything, considering its alpha damage, it is actually pretty nice. And one thing I did forget to mention, AP on this ammo, premium ammo, is actually very good. Most tanks which have more damage on their premium have an HE shell, and that HE shell usually has 200 to 210mm of penetration. So HE doesn't go through obstacles, it can't go through space armor, generally it has pretty slow shell velocity, and it can't overmatch. AP, on the other hand, it can do all those, so it is actually very nice to have such good penetration on its premium AP. Next, in terms of its speed, 27 forwards, more like a mouse, just slightly faster. Reverse speed is 15, which is the same as a mouse, for example. Acceleration rate is 10.5 horsepower per ton, and it has 2000 horsepower for its 202 ton weight. On hard terrain, the acceleration rate is the same. On medium, on hard terrain, its traverse speed is 27, which is decent. It's nothing great, but again, remember, this tank is massive, and it has got very good armor, even on the sides, so if it did turn too fast, it would be kind of too strong for what its armor offers. Its actual acceleration is 8.7 horsepower per ton when you do go on medium terrain, and then 22 degrees per second of traverse speed, which is, again, is pretty slow, but for such a big tank, it's not the worst thing in the world. So next, let's talk about very quickly its camo. It does come with one legendary camo at the moment in the crates, and this is that legendary camo. It does have another camo which is 2D. I'm not actually sure how you're supposed to obtain that at the moment, but for now this is the camo you can obtain. And the other camo isn't anything really that special. This is the 3D one, and the other camo is 2D. But in terms of its consumables, I just use adrenaline, repair, and multi-purpose restoration pack because this tank does get quite a lot of engine damage. Its transmission is in the front where the lower plate is, so you do get shot there quite a lot, and it's quite similar to German tanks with its engine damage. Next, in terms of provisions, just use the regular setup. You could drop this out for protective kit, but I personally don't. And then of course you definitely need improved fuel, just because this tank is, well, one of the slowest tier 10 heavy tanks. Next, don't use gun rammer. Despite this tank having an 18-second reload, 19 if you don't use gun rammer, it does not need that faster reload, it does not need higher DPM. This tank isn't a DPM tank, it's about damage trading, so what's more important than reloading quick is actually making sure that your shot does indeed penetrate the enemy, and it does indeed deliver that massive 800 alpha. And considering this tank has premium AP, it does just make it very nice when you do use calibrated shells up to 220mm of penetration, which for reference is roughly the same as a tier 9 medium. Next, engine accelerator or improved control, either of these can work. Improved control will help you turn your hull faster and angle to enemies a bit faster, but then engine accelerator does just help you to utilize your top speed a bit more, even though you don't have very much top speed, let's be honest. Next, enhanced armor or improved assembly. Don't use improved assembly. I think you'd be insane to use improved assembly. This tank has 2800 base HP, which is already one of the best in tier 10. It has got very solid armor, but that armor is just on the level of where enemy tanks can actually penetrate. So let's go and see with using the E5 for an example. So let's say the E5 is looking at the Type 5 Heavy. You can see here the front of the Type 5 does have these 2 weak points, and they are just right on the level of where it may be penetrable, a roughly 50-50 chance. But put on enhanced armor and those become red. On top of this, you can also see the weak points on the lower plate and the cupola do become just slightly smaller. So it does have some use for that, but the main thing is when you are using premium ammo. In this case, the E5 has 340mm, which is above average. Most have 330 or even down to 320. And you can see the difference it will make with enhanced armor. The upper plate here, slightly penetrable, again roughly 50-50. The turret front is completely penetrable, but put on enhanced armor, the turret front becomes a little bit more troll, harder to pen, a roughly 50-50 now, and the upper plate is just not penetrable. So you can see it does actually make a big difference against the penetration level of something like an E5, for example. But we can also have a quick look at, for example, a Kranvang, which would always use calibrated shells. You can see here, again, the penetration of this tank 350mm goes right through the upper plate with no issues, goes right through the turret front with no issues. Put on enhanced armor though, it does become just harder to penetrate, and of course you can slightly angle the hull. It does make this part weaker, but that part is smaller than the entirety of the upper plate. So you can see that enhanced armor does actually make a really big difference for the armor profile of the Type 5 Heavy. Actually, it's like this, considering I was not pressing the right buttons a moment ago. However, for me personally, I would say enhanced armor is the way to go on this tank. Next, gun lane drive. This tank has very slow aim time, and you can see the massive benefit gun lane drive does, 8.8 seconds. However, supercharger, I personally don't use it because most of the time I find myself fighting in close ranges with this tank. Yes, the higher shell velocity would be really nice, but I cannot imagine how slow of an aim time it would be if I did indeed use supercharger. So this one, really try out yourself, and if you really hate the shell velocity, then switch over to supercharger and give that a try. Next, vertical stabilizer or refined gun. This one really would be a personal choice for you. For me, I use vertical stabilizer just because I prefer that slightly better aim time, and I find the dispersion for me is completely okay. However, you may want to use refined gun based on your own personal preference. So I do have 2 replays in the Type 5 Heavy which I do want to show. The first one here is going to be on Yukon, and you can see there's quite a few heavy tanks, so I'm going to be going towards the sea area. Talking about the gameplay of this tank, it's essentially similar to the E100 or the Mouse. It is a slow heavy and it has a long reload. So on top of that, it's also very large, so you don't want to be taking it to the medium flank at all. If you're on the medium flank, your reload is going to cause you some massive issues. Your accuracy and your slow shell velocity against the faster, smaller medium tanks also will cause some issues. And on top of that, you're just really big, so mediums with their good mobility can easily get to your side, flank around, and deal just good damage to your side armor where you can't really angle up properly because you're big and slow. So take it to the heavy flank like I have done here. So I see the concept and the VZ are over here. I decide I'm going to push for them and try to support this Rinoceronte. However, I do make a bit of a bad play here. I don't look at the side, I get shot by the E6, and I'm pretty lucky that the Gorilla 15 wasn't looking at me and the VZ bounces. But now you can see I've noticed the Gorilla, so I'm being a bit more careful. And you can see here the concept, even with his low penetration of 310 on heat, he can still go through my lower plate. But you can just see the really nice thing about this tank's alpha damage. 2 shots and I've done 1500 damage to that concept. And now the E6 is going to try coming around the side, and you can see the issue with this tank just being very big. The E6 tried to go for my cupola, and then the VZ went for my cupola as well, despite me being behind cover. So here I decide I'm not in a good situation, I'm going to try and fall back if I can. Hopefully my armor will cover me, and yes, the E6 bounces. I managed to do, I believe, 868 damage to that E6. And I think I also bounced a shot from the Gorilla 15. But you can just see the massive alpha of this tank and how it is so good for trading. On top of that, it has tons of hit points, and you're essentially a tank that forces enemies to use premium ammo. You can see there I hit the Gorilla 15 on the tracks. My shell didn't penetrate, but because the Gorilla 15 is so lightly armoured and my damage on HE is so high, I still managed to do 600. And now you can see against this VZ, I can't quite side scrape, so I'm actually going to just poke my whole front around the corner and hope that he bounces or just doesn't shoot me. And there we go, another shell, 891 into the VZ55. Now he's left on 49 HP. I'm just going to load HE because historically with this HE I have never done under 200 damage no matter where I've hit on an enemy tank. So just snapshot the track and the VZ55 is dead. Unfortunately I'm not going to reload in time for this E4, but you can still see this tank. How it's actually pretty proficient in a brawl situation as long as you can manage that reload, and you do have some support from your team. But in that game, almost blocks 1,800 damage, did 4,000 damage, and of course because it was an ace I do make a good amount of credits, 125,000. But moving on to the next battle. So the next battle is on Port Bay, and this battle, while it's nothing insane, I did want to show it for a few reasons. But first let me point out the mobility of the Type 5 Heavy. You can see there my traverse speed, not exactly fast, but again, this is a massive tank. You can see right now I'm already basically up to my 27 km/h top speed. So yes, this tank isn't particularly fast in tier 10, in fact it's the slowest after the mouse. However, for how much armour and how big of a gun this tank carries, it definitely doesn't feel insanely slow, and you are still able to reach the front line most of the time and be able to still have a good impact in the battle. So you'll see here, the enemies haven't been spotted on this flank, so I'm just going to push right through with our Kampfpanzer 17. Now the Kampfpanzer 50T is spotted, he's on low HP, so I go for an HE, but you can see there the slow shell velocity causes me to miss the Kampfpanzer. Again, only 400 meters per second on the HE. But now I'm going to switch to HE again because I'm going to see there is a very nice opportunity on the rear of this Concept 1B. And you can see here 1,200 damage dealt to the rear of the Concept. And currently there is no other heavy tank which can do that. And again, against the AMX-50, you can see I can penetrate his sides, and also the rangefinder on top, so I do go for another HE shot dealing almost 900 damage. But now I'm going to go back, and you'll see this Jagdpanzer E100, his alpha damage is 800, and I'm going to put into him 786 damage. So you can equally trade with a Jagdpanzer E100, and you just have a lot more HP than the Jagdpanzer, with 2,800, which is tons for a tier 10 heavy tank, and your armor forces enemies to load premium, which you'll see. The Jagdpanzer used premium, he did 680 damage to me, I did 700 back to him. He just got out-traded by a heavy tank. But now, again, you'll see this tank, slow reload. So, of course, its DPM isn't terrible, but you do take a long time to reload. And I'm going to try go for a shot on this Kampfpanzer, but unfortunately blocked by the WZ, the FE, FE again, and then I managed to get in the shot for 725 damage. So you can see on this tank, despite it having pretty low penetration, you can still deal with situations, and most of the time that penetration is actually sufficient. If you're going for lower plates, if you're going for cupola weak points, you can actually deal with enemies with such damage and penetration. But in that battle I did around 4,300 damage, and again made a decent amount of credits as this is a collector. So here I just quickly wanted to show a few clips of the Type 5 which I believe are pretty important. So you'll see here on Falls Creek I'm going up to a usual heavy tank position for this tank. I have my premium AP loaded, but there is a Hori which I can't even penetrate with standard. You can see there, I just put a shot above his engine deck and dealt 400 damage. Yes, it's a long way off my usual 800 or 700, but 400, considering it is HE splash and I barely had to aim, is still a good amount of damage. And you'll see here, the Hori comes back for another shot, and I managed to do 500 damage to him there. So yes, I've taken a shot in return, but in 2 HE shots I've done 900 to the Hori. That's just the power of this tank's very high damage HE. And here, the last thing I want to show about the Type 5 Heavy is of course the max roll. 1000 damage. It does happen, and it is really satisfying to do. As you can see, that Contra Caro going from almost 1100 HP down to just 96 in a single shot from this tank. So, the conclusion on the Type 5 Heavy. I think that this tank is a very good tank, a great tank. It has got very high hit points. Combine that with the fact its armour basically forces you to use premium ammo, which of course lowers your damage and thus increases the Type 5's effective HP. And then on top of this, combine the fact that it has just 800 alpha damage, which makes it very good at trading. For example, I showed the clip where I was facing the Jagdpanzer E100. He has 800 alpha, sure, he was forced to load premium ammo, which took him down to 680, and meanwhile I put my 800 alpha shot into him. So yeah, it can out-trade some of the highest damage tanks in the game. So this tank is just really very good, I would say, for at least random battles, and it is something that's pretty unique. It is similar enough to the E100 in gameplay that, you know, it doesn't feel like anything super different, but it does have enough traits to make it unique and worth playing, which are of course different from something like the E100 or the 60TP, for example. So yeah, this tank, it is pretty enjoyable to play, especially if you like high alpha, reliable armor tanks. It's unfortunate that it is coming in money only crates, and hopefully it comes back in the future for gold or some other method of obtainment. But yeah, that is it for the Type 5 Heavy. Thanks for watching.